And you know when you pick up a book and you start reading, you're going, oh, that sounds really cool. That's why I can't spend time on the internet, right? I sit down and look up one thing, and 2 hours later, you're over here, and all you did was go look up, you know, what date something happened, right? I don't know how people who are historians manage to stay on track. But anyway, several years ago, oh my God, you get old. 10 or 15 years ago, I started researching jails in Texas and enjoyed the history of those. We looked at the courthouses. So through the years, this has been more a hobby to balance my vocation, right? And I've done a lot of things on jails, and this was a little one on one of those rabbit trails where you're looking at what happens to justice in the frontier. How was criminal justice carried out in the early days? And if you've done any research, you know that there's a whole lot of different things going on, so I'm going to bounce around a little bit, but I actually do have a road I'm going down, and I'll get there. But to tell you a little bit, the Historic Village has a great collection of history books about law enforcement, the Texas Rangers, different aspects of criminal justice in Taylor County and Texas. And I think some of them even cover the nation too. So be sure and visit our bookstore to see if there's something that piques your interest, because they do have a lot of little ones that you don't see in a big library. So that's kind of nice. All right, I'm going to start talking here. I told you about myself, that's enough. Okay. I haven't done this particular presentation before, so bear with me, because I got a whole lot of information, and I know I've got like 45 minutes to tell you. So, and that's hard for me because being a college professor, I'm used to saying, okay, we'll finish this up on Wednesday or next week or something, so bear with me here. But I am enthusiastic, if nothing else. All right. As you know, as the United States was settled, we had a variety of law enforcement issues. Now, of course, we started on the East Coast, and I'm going to pick it up as we start settling the frontier. And the frontier is west of the Mississippi, basically. And of course, you can go on all kinds of dog trails on that, and you know that as well as I do. But we're kind of going to start in the middle to late 1800s, and I'm going to talk a little bit about law enforcement and how we carried out justice back then. So there we go, we're heading west. Not only the good folks, everybody that came along with it. All right, there's several issues, and being my background, you're going to have to bear with me. One of the things when you're looking at law enforcement in the American West, and as we come forward, you have different jurisdictions going on. So this was a real issue. So back on the East Coast, in New York City, and Boston, and Philadelphia, those had been settled for 100 years or so. So you had police departments established. You had county law enforcement. We're going to touch on that just a little bit, okay, as we go through this. But as you go further west, you didn't have those institutions established yet because it was open territory. So when you have a territory that's not a state, who's in charge? Yeah.
The marshal.
The sheriff.
The feds, okay? Basically, it's federal territory. So as you go west and you leave the states, remember, let's take some poor frontier guy who comes from Boston, loads up his family, and they're heading west. In Boston at this time, in the 1800s, they had an established police department, okay? As cities grew, they had police departments. So as you went further west, then you got to county sheriffs, and then you got to where there was just some states, but just a state was there, like Oklahoma or Missouri or something, but there really wasn't a lot of cities yet. And then as you left any established state, you went into territories. And then who rules is the federal government. So that's what the first you start off with, okay? So you have federal, state, county, and city. This is why when you have something happen, let's say in Taylor County, and you're going, who's responsible? And it's, let's pick Abilene. You got Abilene Police, you got Taylor County, the DPS can show up, and then let's say they rob a bank, you got the feds involved. So this is why when you see a crime on TV, in fact, my husband and I were talking this morning about Las Vegas and all the the shootings and stuff, and you keep seeing the sheriff talk. I'm going, I don't understand why we're still seeing the sheriff. It should be Las Vegas Police Department because it's a city. So I did my little research. Las Vegas is one of the few cities that has a county and the police department is merged. So the sheriff is actually over the city police department too. Learn something new every day, you know? But if you go to another city like Los Angeles, you always see the police department and then you have a separate Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. That's the same thing here, okay? So you're going, oh my gosh, she's telling me more than I wanted to know. But that's what happens. And this is why when you start looking at things like who does the punishment, and you're looking at the early West or any time, it's very confusing. It's confusing from a research viewpoint. It's confusing from when you watch those movies and you're going, why is Marshall Dillon doing that? You know, or whatever it is, you know, you're always finding fault with it. All right, so there's a little bit of who the actors are going to be that are supposed to be carrying out the laws. Okay? So, over this, you have each state is different. So, considering the fact we're talking about Texas, of course, I've got a date line here from Texas. Now, as you see, Texas formed before, so you got the federal law enforcement, but when Texas became its own state, it also formed its own police. And that was sanctioned by Austin in the early 1800s. And basically it was to help keep control of the riffraff, of the Indians, and of the stuff that was going on when you came into a frontier. Now, as you know, this was when the law comes to Texas. This was a gift today. You can spend an entire lifetime just studying the Texas Rangers and that rabbit trail. And it's an interesting history. It's fascinating how they've developed, because each state has its own state police department. And originally, when these rangers developed in Texas, we did later on have a state police developed separately. Today, they're merged. And this is why when you're talking about criminal justice in the United States that it developed, it can be very confusing. But it's also lots of fun. So, all right, so until 1870, we actually didn't see the Texas State Police evolve. And those evolved separately from the Texas Rangers. And the whole history behind that's really cool because, of course, the Texas Rangers weren't happy. The Texas Police weren't happy. It all boils down to politics and if I put it in the vernacular, pissing matches. And we wind up with today's Texas State Police, okay? So be sure if you like that history, there's a lot of things going on there that are a lot of fun. Okay. That's what I'm telling you. See, we got a lot of steps. So let me move along here. All right, we're going to start off with federal marshals because this is where when you're in the territories, when you're in the open, even down to Texas, once we became a state, the federal government still presided. So one of the first federal agencies that was created in order to govern the frontier was the U.S. Marshal Service. All right? The U.S. Marshal Service was established to cover anybody, any state, territory that didn't have law enforcement in effect. So, as you can guess, at this time, where were we? Where was the frontier back in the late 1700s? It was back around probably Chicago, maybe that far. Anyone remember? See, there's so many threads of history that you have to look at to figure out what's going on and where things were occurring across. I would dare say it wasn't probably the frontier was probably about Philadelphia. So every place west of that was governed by whoever was appointed as marshal. And the marshal reported to Congress and the president. So you appoint this marshal, send him west and go, here's your job. That's a big job. Do we have a lot of oversight? No. I mean, you know, it's not like now where you pick up your phone and you're talking to someone every 30 seconds driving them crazy. Back then you wrote a letter, right? Maybe it got to them. All right. Now, the way that marshals built their forces was they could appoint deputies. So they just went around and said, okay, I'm appointing you, you're now my deputy. Now the marshals got paid $90 a month. The deputies only got paid per diem. So they got paid per mile, and they got paid when they picked up someone. But other than that, they didn't get much of a paycheck. Which again speaks to all the confusion, because as you start researching this, and if you've done any research on anything from the Dalton brothers to, of course I'm going blank now, but the various other desperados that you read about, a lot of times they were former marshals or deputies. And this would happen because they'd get out there and they couldn't make a living. And they'd be out there, with the James gang or whoever it was, and they'd go, you can make more money with us than hauling us in. So a lot of times you see former White Earp, and I know y'all have examples too. I mean, you can probably think of someone off the top of your head that I'm just going blank on, of course. Who'd you name?
Harrison.
Yes, they, at one time they were on the good side and then they go to the bad side. The other side happens too. Sometimes they wind up on the good side, and they were former bad guys. So when you're looking historically, it can be very confusing because you're going, who is this? And at that particular time, was he a good guy or a bad guy? Which is fun in one way, and another way, it makes you pull your hair out, all right? All right. Originally, and today, the marshals basically are supposed to be doing a lot of civil duties. So along with carrying out the laws and whatever the federal government decreed, and something like, for example, every law they would come along and enforce. Robbing banks actually didn't become against the law until 1923 as a federal law. So before that, it was just a robbery. It wasn't considered a federal law. So you have laws come in and you have reactions to those laws. All right, one of our most famous marshals that came out, or judges, is Judge Parker. You may have heard Judge Parker. He was called the hanging judge. He was the first judge who was over the Arkansas district. And the interesting thing is, even though he was called the hanging judge, he was against capital punishment. All right? Now, he had more than 200 men, which sounds like a lot, except he was also covering 70,000 square miles. So all the way from the northern Canadian border almost, all the way down through Texas. That was where his jurisdiction was. Now, he was appointed because prior to him being appointed, this is a territory, and the law enforcement was only carried out by the Indian tribes. So you had the 5 nations that lived within the Indian territory. They could only enforce Indian crimes. So crimes that were committed on the reservations by Indians. So bad guys could come in and take advantage of them, kill them, do whatever they wanted to, and take back off. So they actually appealed to the courts to have a marshal appointed within their areas to help them out with the law enforcement on the reservations. All right? When he was appointed, he was only supposed to serve 4 months out of the year. But the banditry and violence was so bad that within 90 days, he had tried and convicted over 90 men. He was working every day, 10 hours a day. And he kept this up through his tenure for 21 years. He was just trying them as fast as they brought him in. Okay, but here's the cool thing about it. Even though he was called the hanging judge, he wanted everybody to get their fair shake in court. So if you were a marshal, you better bring your guy in alive. Period. He didn't want him dead or alive. He wanted him alive in court in order to be able to give him a fair trial. All right, so I've got a number here, and that's what I'm looking. During his appointment, he tried over, I had to write down these figures to make sure I remember them correctly, even though it's not a test, right? He tried over 17,000 cases. 17,000 cases, that's a lot of people. And of those sentenced, only 1% were sent to the gallows. So he really didn't hang a lot of people. bring him to, what the deal was, he wanted his marshal to bring him to him, and I'll find him guilty. You weren't supposed to be doing this out there on the trail, okay? So if you brought someone and you killed him in transit, he would charge the marshal, I like this part, he'd charge him for the prisoner's funeral, casket, and headstone. The cost was close to $60, and considering the fact you only earned 6 cents per mile and $2 for picking up that guy, it took a big chunk of change out of you. So if you didn't bring your guys in alive, he charged you. So this is why he was called the hanging judge. Kind of not really a truism there on what he wanted. But he really wanted the court to be the face of justice, not the marshals, not the deputies that were out there. Now, he did have about 200 deputies. Through his course of tenure as judge, 109 of those guys were killed. So it was a dangerous, dirty job. You went out, you had to bring these guys back. They weren't particularly wanting to come back. They weren't nice guys. And you were only getting paid $2 to haul them all the way from here up to Fort Smith. Okay? So it could be quite a tenuous job. All right. So Marshall, we're going to use my husband here. Marshal Bob goes out to Palo Pinto to pick up some guy that has killed his wife. All right? The townspeople have to put him somewhere and hold him so they don't want to kill him. Now, we'll get to vigilantism, but many cities, and if you go across not only Texas, but the West, you'll come across these. I can remember years ago seeing one of these down along the Rio Grande. It was Candelaria, wasn't it? Candelaria. Yeah, because we came on it and we're like, what is this thing? Okay, so these were called tumbleweeds. They were called tumbleweeds because they were just kind of scattered across. Now, there were different ways that they would deal with them. So you have your Marshal Bob is going to ride his little pony all the way down there to Candelaria in order to haul this guy back to Fort Smith. Okay? So we have, this is just an example of another one, we have tumbleweed wagons. So in some places they would be able to put this into a wagon and then you'd drive it back and you'd have a chow wagon and you'd have a whole contingent of men with you to haul it all the way back to Fort Smith so that the judge could try them. Now it could take weeks or months to haul these guys back. They were chained inside. When they stopped for the night, they'd chain them to a tree or to the wagon wheels, and they were considered quite entertaining going through your town. Remember, you're out here in Candelaria and you don't have anything else coming through. Buffalo Gap back then, when they had population 10, can you imagine one of these coming through? You know, it's like a circus. You know? Plus, everybody knew who was in it. So they would go all the way back. Today, or later on in the 1800s, once they went to where the cities were bigger, in some of the smaller towns, what they did was you took that and you just built your jail around it. So, historically, you could just build your little jail around there and you had your little cage already. Right? You have your little town, got your cage. Then as history goes on, the jail disappears, the building disappears, but you're back to that. Those were actually made by a company called Poly that today still makes equipment for jails and still builds jail cells. So they found a growth industry and you know, it's like toilet paper. Everybody needs one. So there's our tumbleweed wagon. And of course, as you get more fancy jails, you get bathrooms and everything else. Yes.
Okay, if I ask a question?
Yes, yes, sir.
Is there no protection from the weather, the heat, the rain, the cold?
Nope.
With those things?
Nope, and I'm thinking by the time they got to wherever they were being tried, they were probably happy to be hung. Because you're right. And, you know, during the day, we don't think about this. We really don't, because there was something, and I'm sure you studied this in school, about the stocks, you know, where they put in the early England stuff. If you think about it, when they put those people in stocks or tied them up, they didn't let them go. So you stood there, it sounds like, oh, how bad is that? Well, what's bad, sooner or later, you're going to have to go to the bathroom. Sooner or later, you're going to need thirsty or hungry. And you're right, man, that's a pretty miserable trip. But remember, they wanted to keep him alive so they'd get him to the judge, because otherwise he'd charge him. So he did have a good way of trying to keep him at least semi-alive when they got there. Didn't mean they had to be real alive, just alive enough to hang. All right. I picked Bass Reeves as one of our samples of an early marshal because he was the first black marshal that served underneath Judge Parker. He was a former slave who was raised by Indians, and so when he became a deputy for for the judge, and then later on became appointed a marshal. So underneath, get my eye on the clock, don't I? Now, he couldn't read and write, but he could remember names and crimes. And he never brought in the wrong person for the wrong crime. So he would look through the list, they would tell him what he needed to know, and he would go out and he would find it. Since he was raised by the Indians, he was considered an extremely good tracker. So he could go out and follow these guys. He was 6'2", 180 pounds, and it said very few people wanted to fight against him because he was so big and intimidating. Now realize, the average guy was like 5'2" back then. So he was like a behemoth compared to them. During his work, he arrested more than 3,000 people. He was 32 years a deputy. It says the most difficult one that he had to arrest was his own son, who killed his wife, and he had to arrest his son, who was later served time in Leavenworth for 10 years. All right? So there we have an example of it, and he's dressed pretty snappy there. I like that. All right, here we go. We have one of the hangings that's going on at Fort Smith. This guy was Cherokee Bill. 86 men were executed at Fort Smith. Now let me remind you, these were ones that were legally tried and hung, okay? So you go through the process. These aren't vigilantes, but this is justice during that time. Now it's not until the I'm trying to remember the year, that we will wind up taking away hanging and replacing it with electrocution in Texas. Other states had other means of execution. But as the states develop, as the territories become a state, at first the executions happen at the federal level, and then in Texas they go to the county level. And then the state will take over in the mid-1900s, early 1900s. And at that point they'll go from hanging to execution, because if you know any of the history about how they developed electricity, that was one of the points that Edison was fighting about, because it's a big good way to kill people off. It's more humane than hanging. So it was the method of execution in Texas for years and years. All right. Yeah, that's what I want. Okay. So I talked a little bit about the state law enforcement, which in Texas we have the Texas Rangers. In California, you have something like the Highway Patrol. All right? And it was the 1930s before every state had some kind of state law enforcement. And remember, while it says that, while I found a thing that said that, at the same time, Hawaii didn't become it. Hawaii or Alaska was the last one to enter the Union.
Hawaii is the last one.
Do you remember the year?
1960s in my mind. I think it was late 59.
Yeah, I think that sounds right too. So it wouldn't have been until then that they would have had a state police department, because before that there were territory.
Yeah.
Like Puerto Rico, which is part of the United States. Okay? Just in case you're wondering that. All right. What we have here is a few unidentified Texas Rangers. Remember, they kind of started as a posse. All right. Austin was authorized to appoint Texas Rangers under Mexican law. This was before Texas was a state. Now, they weren't Texas Rangers then. They were called ranging law enforcement. They were because they moved around, right? And it eventually developed into the name Texas Rangers. But it wasn't their, originally that's not what they were. They were just kind of another posse, is the way I gather it. All right? But in the 1890s, they were the ones who enforced the law all the way down to the Pecos, up to the Oklahoma River, or what is it, the Red River. So they stayed for quite a while. Something else that what was interesting too is through this time. Now remember, if you're having vigilantism and people or community hangs someone, and I'm going to get to that a little bit more. After you hang someone for murder, cattle rustling, horse thievery, rape, we have a whole long list of things that you could kill people for. If you weren't real sure, you just made something up. Well, if the community runs out, forms a posse, hangs someone, what do you do with them? Well, once the Texas Rangers formed, if a community hung someone or lynched someone, as it later became known, they would call the Texas Rangers and let them know where that body was hanging, so that the Texas Rangers could go record the body and bury it, do something with it, because they didn't want to. And when the Texas Rangers buried them, if it's someone that had been hung, they would take the noose and hang it over the tombstone. I guess it's like those people that hang coyotes on their fence, figuring that's going to deter other coyotes from coming there. You know, look what we do to you in our community. All right. In about 1891 to 95, and that's 1 year, during that time the Rangers scouted over 173,000 miles, made 667 arrests, and returned over 2,800 head of stolen livestock to owners. All right, this guy, and those of y'all that are Texas Rangers aficionados and historians know Bill McDonald. Bill McDonald's the one who you hear the phrase, one fight, one ranger. He showed up in Dallas to break up an illegal boxing match. Apparently you couldn't have this. We also had one, a big one, if you know, down on the Rio Grande at one time too. And he showed up, he got off the train. They said, well, where's the contingent? And he said, you only have one boxing match, you only need one ranger. So from that became that one ranger saying that you'll hear sometimes when you're studying this. All right, we go back. Wait, okay. All right. This is Sam Bass. Now, Sam Bass was a robber. Now, I want to talk a little bit about these kind of reward posters. Do you see wanted dead or alive? Okay. So, depending on where you were taking him, the marshal didn't want him dead, because if he showed up with him dead, he can't take him to the judge, can he? So, we wind up with a lot of mixed signals about what you're supposed to do with the bad guys. Do you kill them? Do you take them back alive? And honestly, just the logistics. If you ride out somewhere 200 miles, let's say you go to Alpine, pick up some prisoner, capture him, and you kill him, how do you get him back? How long is it going to take you to get back on your pony? A couple months? What do you do with that body? Sorry. Kind of decomposes. So, bringing someone back dead really wasn't such a good idea. You always see him riding into town right with that body hanging over the saddle. Jeez, probably smell that 6 miles away. All right, this was another guy that was part of the Sam Bass gang. These two guys, the reason I have them on here is because they were killed by the Texas Rangers. That's who captured them. So, just as an example of what the Texas Rangers did. I'm trying to see here. Okay, Sam and Seaborn, so I'll make sure I'm just going to combine this story. They were both killed. Sam was killed, this one was injured. When they went to rob a bank, a new member of the gang reported it to the Texas Rangers. So the Texas Rangers showed up and kind of disrupted that. They killed Barnes, he was shot in the head, and this guy, He'd been shot before, and they shot him this time too, and he was unconscious, but they'd shot him before, and they knew where they'd shot him, so they identified him from the wounds on his body. All right? He wound up dying from his wounds, and he was buried next to the other guy. So, it's pretty bad when I remember shooting him before. So let's go on here. All right. County law enforcement, as you know, you're going down on the jurisdiction. Once you have your state, then you have county, and you get sheriffs appointed. You also have your county, your constable inside each one of these too. So this is why when you're trying to, okay, what do I want to study here? And which route am I going? You have to pick someone, which is kind of difficult sometimes. All right. This was the original sheriff in Taylor County. Now you should have recognized this building here. And if you know a little bit about Buffalo Gap, the Buffalo Gap used to be the
County seat.
The county seat, thank you. They got into a big political thing, I'm with the railroad, of course, you know, the railroad dictated where county seats move. So the railroad goes up there, county seat I'm giving you the thumbnail, there's entire books on this. County seat moves up to Abilene. So here's the Buffalo Gap Jail, all right? Here's the Abilene Jail. So when they moved the county seat, there's the jail up there. It was kind of a step down for the inmates, wasn't it? All right? This one wound up getting torn down and replaced later on by a nice little jail. But the interesting thing is, this is one little story that you can find a lot of stuff, interestingly enough, on the New York Times. You go back to the New York Times historical database and they got cool things. At one point, there were some guys in here who had been charged with cattle thievery. All right? So they talked their friends into breaking them out. The way they want them to break them out, they want to burn down the building. Do we wonder why they were in jail? So that didn't work real well. The fire department managed to put it out, and so it was an unsuccessful attempt, jailbreak. This is and in the early days, quite often you hear the term calaboose. That's just a jail, just a little bitty jail. More than likely built around the little, you can see here, you see, now this is Fort Griffin. Some of y'all may have been up there, but what do you see inside there? You see the shell. So sometimes, jails were really, really bad back then. This one over here, it actually has a bathroom in it. It does, it has a little toilet. If you go in that room, which normally we keep that locked, but if you go in the room, there's a little toilet there. The toilet goes right out the wall. So, yep. So that means if you're in there doing your business, whoever's standing outside is smelling all this business. It's really pretty, so maybe it wasn't so bad going to the bathroom in the other room. We don't think of the logistics of some of this stuff. All right. We also have in the cities, as they develop, city marshals, which are different than your city police chief. So and this is why it gets so confusing when you're watching this on the movies and things, and you're going, why are they saying this or why are they saying this? It is the jurisdiction. This is why I get paid to teach college classes, to teach the difference between all this. Right? But when you're doing the history stuff, the names all flow together. A lot of times someone started out as a marshal, they later became a sheriff, or they got appointed as a police chief, or they become a judge. So you'll see some of these same names historically, so it can really be confusing. And especially once you figure this out, it kind of gives you a nosebleed. All right. The Dalton brothers were killed. I like these people. Go to where they were. Now we're going to get, can I move them? Make sure. Oh, I wanted to talk about the Dalton brothers just a little bit because they started out, Frank Dalton, who was the oldest one, started out as a deputy U.S. Marshal. But after he didn't get paid for bringing people in, he turned to a life of crime. So these were well-known bank robbers, right? So for several years, they went around and they literally were trying to outdo Jesse James, who was during this same time period. So evidently there were, I don't know, they kept points or something on who's robbed the most banks. So they were trying to rob more banks than Jesse James. Well, they wind up getting killed because they go to Coffeeville. Is that right? Can't remember right. Where they go in to rob the bank, the bank tellers recognize them. They manage to delay him enough that the city marshal shows up outside with residents that he's deputized. Hey, well, we're all coming. So a shootout ensues. They leave the jail. 3 of them get killed. The city marshal gets killed. 3 townsmen get killed. But there we go. Justice on the frontier. So they lay him out. One of the things that we'll see, I'm going to check my time. We'll see later on, you're going, man, they took pictures of this. Because we didn't have Instagram and all these things back then. If you wanted to get a bounty for them, you had to prove that you killed them, that they were dead. And I guess you probably had some people fake it too, but you had to get the camera there, and then you have your picture so that you can show what's going on. All right, this is early Abilene Police Department. As you can see, we're starting to, at this point, this is, what year do we got here? I don't have a date on this. Early 1920s, 30s, most police departments by that time had uniforms and nightsticks or guns. The carrying of guns in American police departments has always been historically part of us settling the frontier. Our law enforcement has always been armed because we were killing off Indians. Another way to put it. So once we did that, we decided to keep the guns. All right, these are just some different wanted posters from that time. So if you wanted to make your living as a bounty hunter, this is what you did. Now mind you, someone like the marshals or the deputies, they would take these posters and they would want to get paid too. So remember, you got to prove that you killed them. So this kind of created a problem once cameras became better too, because you could collect that bounty. Now remember, if you took them back to judge, what did you get paid? $2. If you didn't want to hassle with taking them all the way back across the country to your local federal judge, you just prove it and just pay your fine, right? But you killed him. But this guy's been shot numerous times, right? And it was quite common in towns when they killed an outlaw or someone that had committed a crime, that a photographer would come and everybody would want their picture taken with them. Oh yeah, so you get all these pictures of dead people. But it wasn't just as an aside, it wasn't just the criminals. Let's say someone in your family had died during this time, you would get a picture of them too. So when a cameraman, when a traveling camera came to town, basically, they took pictures of everything. Because that was the only way you got a picture at that time. And it might be 15 years before someone came through your community again. So you take a picture of your family, maybe you with your kids, someone had just died. And quite often, if someone had just died recently, good or bad, they dig them back up. Take a picture of them. Okay? This particularly happened in some of the more isolated western areas where a notorious criminal would be killed, and they wanted to prove it, so the media would come to town, and they'd go, yeah, we did kill him. They'd go dig him up, There, we take a picture too. See, sometimes you look at these pictures, they're kind of funky looking. It's because you're looking at someone who's been dead a while, right? During this time, vigilantism is of course going on, because as you can tell by the disbursement of law enforcement across the United States, if Joe kills his wife, it's going to be a long time before justice comes. That even occurs today. Let me give you an example. I interviewed you at the University of Alaska. I decided not to accept the job because I decided 6 months of total darkness was just too freaky. However, one of the things they wanted me to do was I was supposed to be flying out to different remote areas in order to study how they did, how they handled justice within their Indian community, which is really kind of cool. The problem was you could fly out there and not be able to get back for a couple months, so you had to be able to be real flexible in your time thing. One of the issues they have in those kind of remote areas that, I'm from Alaska, never thought about, it's the dead of winter, and Bob kills me, which wouldn't be surprising at all. But justice and the police department can't get there for 4 or 5 months. So what do they do with the body? What do they do with the person that killed him? What do they do as far as justice? Meanwhile, everyone else is here. You got 6 months of darkness, a dead body, someone that you know killed him. How do you handle that? And not only that, many of the tribes have very specific conditions of their own on how to treat this and how to deal with not only the deceased, but the criminal. So it's a very interesting area of study, and basically it's the same thing that we experienced earlier in our history. All right, here we got a group of vigilantes there. Vigilantes were particularly active right after the Civil War because during that time, the West was in a lot of disruption. You didn't have law enforcement established, or if the law enforcement came in, of course, or the Union or the Confederates, it's just a real mess. So during this time, vigilantes were particularly active because the whole community, the whole country was in a state of disarray. There we get a good example. Right. I like this one because it shows they took him out of the jail. This was an old one from Tombstone. They took him out of the jail and lynched him. So quite often they would arrest someone, but the community gets tired of waiting, or emotions are high. And so they break in and they take him out and lynch him. They always looked for a good tree. I'm going to show you just a couple things here. This is way out in Nevada someplace. And look at this, they built a whole little scaffolding. Now they couldn't always find something like that. And actually as I was driving in this morning, I thought, you had to build something like this, particularly if you were in the desert. Now, sometimes we were quite inventive. Here we're using telephone poles. Now you know the old Viewmaster? I can't remember. Do you remember what they used to call those? Stereoscope. That's why this is like this. Because this was a postcard. Remember those photographers? Whenever they took pictures, they became postcards, they became posters, they became camera objects, so it was really kind of interesting. This guy wound up hanging. He was called Navajo Frank because he was considered particularly nasty. He killed a prostitute at one point, but he was hung here because he was going down the road. This guy, who happened to have been a former marshal, he was no longer a marshal, and his wife were walking along the road. According to everybody, there was no conflict between them. But he decided to lasso the guy and drag him down the road. Hauled him up through the cactus, everything else. Someone that was standing there shot and managed to break the rope. So now Frank goes riding off into the sunset. Well, so they form a posse. They go after and get him. Bring him back to the jail where everybody's truly in an uproar. So that night, they break into the jail, overpower the town marshal, and hang him. So, now see, they had arrested him, but they weren't going to wait till the next day. They were really ticked. So the guy that he was hung for, he actually hadn't killed. That guy still lived. But they said, well, he was so nasty anyway, and they know he killed some other people, so it's okay. Sometimes the bank robbers or the train robbers, they just tried him right there when they caught him. All right? This one was a cattle rustler. And this one, this is kind of gross, but it's good for Halloween.
Surprising, there's a stereoscope picture of, that other guy.
I know, but
Why do you want to look at this in 3 dimensions?
Because you could make money off of those, All right, so we got Tom Black Ketchum. He was a train rob one of the trains. He was killed by the train conductors, or injured by the train conductor's shotgun blast, one like this one, okay? So they waited, posse came out, picked him up, hauled him back to jail. They waited for him to get well so that they could hang him, okay? So when they hang him, they did such a poor job of tying the hangman's noose, they decapitated him. This is what the pictures are of, okay? So, it's not done yet. So they bury him. Well, the press comes out from San Francisco and they want to see this famous bank robber who was so famous, or train robber, that as you see, they put out a public notice, an invitation to his hanging. So to see these hangings, you actually had an invitation in some points. So the press comes out, they want to see where he is. Well, they've buried him. So what do? They dig him back up to take the pictures for the press so that they can prove that this is who was killed. This was another professional gunfighter that was hanged. Part of the problem with this vigilantism, or not part of the problem, at least from the point of being hung, as you can see, the way they hung this guy, they draped it over here, so they didn't do an actual hanging where they break your neck, because you see the hangman's noose. You know, you watch the old westerns, and they're out there, man, they can tie that hangman's noose in no time at all, right? Most of the time, they just use a plain old slip knot, which meant wherever you put them to hang, you were just choking them to death. So it could take quite a while to choke someone to death. This particular man, they thought he was dead. They brought him down. He revived. Remember, we don't have real good medicine back there. You're unconscious. They think you're dead. So they had to hang him several times in order to kill him off. And occasionally they would just give up and shoot you. You know, I'm like, okay, this ain't working. So, you know, it can be a real fiasco trying to hang somebody. And can you imagine trying to do this in the middle of Nevada where you have no trees, you know? How do you hang somebody? And the same thing when you're watching these old movies and they put someone on a horse, right? The horse goes running off. Does that break your neck? No, you're just hanging there choking. Not only that, the horse is not that tall, your feet are going to touch. There were a lot of disasters. This one, I included this one, even though it was all the way back to 1862, and it was in Gainesville. It's considered one of the most horrific vigilantes movements in Texas because of the number of people. They had 40 people. They considered him, Confederate Union sympathizers. I just went.
They were Union sympathizers.
Yeah, thank you. So they didn't have real proof. They just came out in the middle of the night and rounded up these guys and killed them. Right? So typically, if the hanging was carried out in a community, and this is one of the reasons they eventually went to behind the doors, is because of the spectacle that occurred as communities started developing and becoming more civilized, right? You started checking your guns at the sheriff's office when you came into town. This was considered a spectacle. You had to have an invitation, people came and they were having parties. It was a Sunday afternoon picnic with you and your family, right? Let's go watch Joe Blow get hung for horse thievery. So it was no longer considered a deterrent. It wasn't doing what they considered what it was supposed to do. Capital punishment is supposed to deter. Yes, it was punishing this guy, but it was at the amusement of the populace. So at that point, it started going behind doors. So it starts being taken over by the state, who considers hanging not the best way, so we go to electrocution. The reason I put in this one about John Lynch, Colonel Lynch, is because this is back from the Civil War. And originally, when you used the term lynch, it meant you were whipping someone. Didn't mean you were hanging them. But his name became synonymous with lynching because it was not legal, the punishment. So it became lynching, and it's known as lynching is typically an illegal hanging, even though that's not originally the term meant. These guys, all right, we're almost done here. There we are. Oh, not too bad. These guys were hung in the barn because they were paid to assassinate the guy in the little one up there, all right? And James Brown up there is the one who's the main killing Jim is what his name was. The man that that they were paid to kill, you see here. Oh, isn't that bad? He was Gus Bott, and he was a former another law enforcement officer. However, during his tenure, he had annoyed the outlaws so much that finally they banded together and paid this group of guys to kill him. All right, so when they got arrested, they actually had all these guys in jail, but somehow the community managed to overpower the sheriff, pull them all out in the middle of the night, and the next morning they were found hung. Now, the sheriff claimed that he wasn't able to stop it, but in the testimony, when you go back and read some of the old testimony, it also says that he hit one of the guys over the head just during them taking it over. So it's kind of like one of those things, they shoved him out the door. So a lot of this was going on. Let's see, where do we want to go? Oh, this was actually the last guy hung into that. All right. This is another invitation. I'm just showing you. Gradually, if it was done by the county and you had someone actually hung in the jail, invitations would go out to the community. So people of prominence would get to watch this. All right? So, all right. This is early 1800s, Huntsville State Prison in Huntsville, which is still there. All right? And 1923, executions moved from the county into Huntsville State Prison. And we had death row there. And they originally were going to hang people, but they implemented the death chamber. All right? One little thing, just so that you know, we were inclusive. This was in Tennessee. All right, can you see these pictures? Yeah? This poor elephant came into town with the circus. You know how they made the circus in town? He stomped on his handler, who was an inexperienced handler. There's a whole gross story. I won't go into it. But she killed her handler. So they decided to kill her. Well, they tried electrocuting her, and she was too big. They tried shooting her, that didn't work. So they finally brought a crane in to hang the poor elephant. So we were pretty big on capital punishment back then. Right? Just as a last comment, desperados and the people that were being hung typically asked if someone died game. So when you were being led, let's get away from this poor elephant. I feel sorry for her. Where does it go? Of course I can't do that. Go back to the prison picture. They wanted to know what the last words were. Well, one of the problems with trying to do research on something like vigilantism in any area is because since it was typically carried out like, okay, we're all pissed at this guy, we're going to go hang him, right? We didn't want anybody to know our names. We didn't want pictures. We didn't want records. So when you look at vigilantism, there's not a lot of history quite often, or you'll see pictures from different events that all have different stories, which I find interesting, because you'll see the same picture, but it'll have a different story with it, depending on where you're looking. But one thing that a lot of the guys that were being hung, they always had last words. If you were one of these train robbers or from the early West, they really thought it was interesting, important for you to die with your boots on. Why? Because if you died with your boots on, it was a statement of professional badness. Only really bad guys died with their boots on. So if you were a good person, and I think it's fine, good person, right? This is the criminal code. You died with your boots off. So they would pay someone to steal their boots, shoot them off, somehow get rid of their boots before they were hung to show that they weren't. But if you wanted to be bad, right? Does that make sense? So you wanted mom to think you were being hung unrightfully, you got your boots off. If you wanted to prove to your fellow bad guys that you were really bad, you went with your boots on. So that was really important to me, which explains why sometimes you get these strange questions. Typically, I'm just going to stop there. Seems kind of odd place to stop, but I've gone through everything. A lot of the research, as far as last words, vigilantism, actually come out, and I didn't even touch on it here, is that the regulator movements, the big cattle wars, you get a lot of history with those, which I didn't even go into, but those were more documented because people thought they were in the right. So even during the Civil War, if you go back to that, say I didn't cover a lot of that, but a lot of those during the Civil War era, the Revolutionary, you'll have photos and names to go with them because they thought they were doing right. When you look at something like vigilantism, they know they're not doing right. So they don't want their pictures out there, right? I hope you enjoyed what I had to say, and I hope you go out there and start looking up some stuff. It's a lot of fun. Do you have any questions?
Did you come across any examples where women were hung?
Actually, there were a few. Typically, they were hung because they were associated with bad guys. But the problem is you don't get the pictures, or you don't get the documentation. But yeah, there were a few. And I saw two different, and I'm real careful with my sources because I saw two different sources, conflicting sources on whether Judge Parker had actually hung a woman. One said he had and one said he hadn't. Most of them they were sent to prison, which, considering the fact if they even made it to a judge, would be real surprising.
Now, you didn't mention a character I was hoping you would mention, Judge Roy Bean.
Oh, yeah. And, he had his own little court down there. He was a former law enforcement, but he was not sanctioned by any legal authority. He was just doing his own thing down there, which you wound up with a lot of the former, you have a frontier town and you want to get crime under control. Who do you hire? You hire someone who's a former bad guy because they know how to handle the weapon, they'll face people. So that's where you get in a lot of that, and that's what with Judge Bean wasn't actually a judge, but he held court down there. Who's going to argue with him? So you had a lot of those kind of stories. He just happens to be one that was most documented. Have you been down there?
No, I haven't. I just remember watching the TV program when I was a kid.
Oh, yeah, and it's a lot of fun, a lot of history to go down there and see, but they did have those kind of, in the really remote areas, there was one of the guys that I kind of skimmed over, particularly in the mining towns. They would literally just set themselves up as judge, jury, sheriff, kind of whoever it was, who was the baddest guy in town became the sheriff. Well, that could go two ways. Maybe he was a good guy, just there, but a lot of times they were running the town. One of them I can remember, they were talking about a mining town in Colorado. 3 brothers moved in. They were former bank robbers and murderers. Each one of them became a different, like the sheriff and the mayor and something else. And they ran a bar. They had killed so many people in the bar, it became known as the Bloody Bar. And finally, the townsfolk had enough of it, I know what had happened. The sheriff had gone out, killed someone else, got injured, went back, told his girlfriend, as she was nursing him, that he'd shot this guy in the back. Well, she was upset enough, she went to town and told everybody, and they proceeded to come out and hang him and those other 2 brothers and get rid of that story. So sometimes, people just get tired of it. And it makes good movies, doesn't it? But I hope you enjoyed today. I hope I touched a little bit and gave you a little bit of interest and not too many nightmares. Yeah.
Thank you.
Are you aware of any books on like comparative justice?